The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace courtyard as 10-year-old Prince George walked slowly toward the garden gate. His small shoulders carried an invisible weight that seemed too heavy for someone his age. Behind him, at a respectful distance, walked Guard Captain Marcus Thompson, a man whose life had been dedicated to protecting the royal family for over 15 years. Marcus had seen many changes in the palace over the years, but nothing had prepared him for the quiet transformation he witnessed in the young prince. George was not like other children his age. While most 10-year-olds would be running, laughing, and causing minor chaos, George moved with careful deliberation. His steps were measured, his voice soft, and his eyes held a depth that spoke of understanding far beyond his years. The morning routine had become sacred to both of them, though neither had ever spoken about it directly. Every day at 7:30, Prince George would emerge from his private quarters and walk the same path through the palace gardens. He would stop at the old oak tree where his great-grandmother used to sit, spend a few minutes in silence, then continue to the memorial garden dedicated to his late great-grandfather, Prince Philip. Marcus watched as George knelt beside a particular rose bush, one that had been planted in memory of a palace staff member who had passed away the previous year. The young prince carefully pulled a few weeds from around the base of the plant and straightened a small memorial stone that had been knocked askew by the recent rain. What struck Marcus most was how George seemed to notice everything and everyone around him. When they passed the kitchen staff heading to work, George would nod politely and ask about their families. He remembered that Mrs. Henderson's daughter had been unwell, that James the gardener's grandson was starting school, and that Sarah from housekeeping was worried about her elderly mother. The prince never demanded attention or special treatment. Instead, he seemed to understand that everyone around him had their own struggles and joys. Marcus had overheard George asking his tutor if they could learn more about the history of the palace staff, wanting to understand the lives of the people who worked so hard to maintain his home. One particular morning, Marcus noticed George stopping longer than usual at the memorial garden. The young prince sat quietly on a small bench, his head bowed slightly. Marcus could see that George was thinking deeply about something, but he maintained his professional distance, ready to provide protection while respecting the prince's need for solitude. When George finally rose from the bench, he turned toward Marcus with those wise, thoughtful eyes. For a moment, the guard captain felt as though the roles were reversed, as if the 10-year-old boy was the one offering comfort and understanding, rather than receiving protection. The walk back to the palace was quiet, as it usually was. George would often pick up small pieces of litter that had blown into the garden paths, not because anyone expected him to, but because he seemed to genuinely care about maintaining the beauty of the space that so many people worked to preserve. Marcus found himself thinking about his own childhood, how different it had been from Prince George's. At 10, Marcus had been worried about football matches and video games, not the weight of future responsibilities or the needs of an entire household staff. Yet George carried his burden with a grace that was both admirable and heartbreaking. As they approached the palace doors, George paused and turned to Marcus. The young prince's voice was soft but clear, as he spoke words that would stay with the guard captain for the rest of his life. He thanked Marcus for walking with him, not just that morning, but every morning. He said he knew it wasn't just a job for Marcus, that he could feel the genuine care and protection in his presence. The simple honesty in George's voice, the lack of any royal pretense or expectation of deference, touched something deep in Marcus's heart. This was not a spoiled child playing at being important. This was a young boy who understood that kindness and respect were not privileges to be granted based on status, but basic human dignities that everyone deserved. Marcus realized in that moment that he was not just protecting a member of the royal family. He was watching over a child who, despite every privilege imaginable, approached the world with humility and genuine concern for others. George's quiet strength was not the result of royal training or protocol lessons. It came from something much deeper, a natural empathy and wisdom that seemed to guide everything he did. As they entered the palace and George headed toward his morning lessons, Marcus found himself questioning things he had never questioned before. For 15 years he had served the crown with duty and honor, but he had always maintained an emotional distance. Royal guards were trained to be professional, vigilant, and detached. Personal feelings were not supposed to enter into the equation. but Prince George's quiet strength was breaking down those carefully constructed walls. The young boy's genuine kindness, his thoughtful consideration of others, and his natural humility were having an effect that Marcus had not anticipated. For the first time in his career, he was beginning to see his role not just as a professional obligation, but as a privilege to witness and protect something truly special. The morning routine continued day after day, each walk revealing more about the remarkable character of the young prince. George never seemed to grow tired of the same path, the same stops, the same quiet moments of reflection. If anything, he seemed to find new meaning in the familiar routine, new ways to connect with the world around him. Marcus began to understand that Prince George's quiet strength was not just impressive for a child of his age and position. It was the kind of strength that could inspire others, that could change the way people thought about leadership, compassion, and service. And somehow, without ever intending to, the young prince was changing the heart of a man who had thought himself immune to such transformation. The day that would change everything began like any other Tuesday morning. Prince George emerged from his quarters at exactly 7:30, ready for his usual walk through the palace gardens. Marcus fell into step behind him, following the familiar routine they had established over the past several months. The sky was overcast with heavy clouds threatening rain, but George seemed determined to complete his morning ritual regardless of the weather. As they walked along the stone pathway toward the memorial garden, Marcus noticed something unusual. Prince George kept glancing toward the staff quarters where a small crowd had gathered near the side entrance of the palace. Even from a distance, Marcus could see that something was wrong. The body language of the staff members suggested distress, and several people appeared to be comforting someone who was clearly upset. Prince George slowed his pace, his young face showing concern. Marcus knew the protocol in such situations was to guide the prince away from any potential disruption and continue with the planned routine. Royal family members were not supposed to become involved in staff matters unless specifically requested to do so by senior palace officials. But Prince George had stopped walking entirely. He stood quietly for a moment, watching the distant group of people, his brow furrowed with worry. Marcus could see the internal conflict playing out in the young boy's expression. George understood the rules and expectations placed upon him, but his natural compassion was pulling him in a different direction. Without asking for permission or guidance, Prince George began walking toward the staff quarters. Marcus felt a moment of panic, knowing that he should redirect the prince back to the planned route. His training told him to gently but firmly guide George away from what appeared to be a private staff matter. But something in the young prince's determined stride made Marcus hesitate. As they approached the group, Marcus could see that the distress centered around Mrs. Elena Vasquez, one of the housekeeping staff members. She was a woman in her early 50s who had worked at the palace for over 20 years. Elena was known for her warm smile and dedication to her work, but this morning she was clearly distraught, tears streaming down her face as her colleagues tried to comfort her. Prince George approached the group with the same quiet dignity he showed in all his interactions. He did not push his way into the center of the crowd or demand immediate attention. Instead, he waited patiently at the edge of the group until someone noticed his presence. When Elena's supervisor, Mrs. Patterson, saw Prince George, she immediately became flustered and began apologizing for the disturbance. She explained that Elena had just received some difficult news and that they would handle the situation quickly and quietly so as not to disrupt the prince's morning routine. But Prince George was not concerned about disruption to his routine. With a maturity that belied his 10 years, he gently asked Mrs. Patterson if he might speak with Elena directly. His tone was not commanding or demanding, but rather the concerned inquiry of one human being trying to help another. Elena looked up in surprise when she realized Prince George was standing nearby. Through her tears, she tried to compose herself and offer the proper curtsy, but George gestured gently for her to remain seated on the small bench where her colleagues had been comforting her. In his soft, careful voice, Prince George asked Elena if there was anything he could do to help. The simple question, asked with such genuine concern, seemed to break through Elena's attempt to maintain professional composure. Fresh tears flowed as she explained that she had just learned her elderly mother in Spain had suffered a severe stroke and was in critical condition in a Madrid hospital. Elena's voice broke as she described her desperate need to travel to Spain immediately. but explained that she did not have enough saved money for the emergency flight. She had been working extra shifts for months to help support her mother's medical care, leaving little for unexpected expenses like international travel. Marcus watched in amazement as Prince George listened with complete attention to Elena's story. The young prince did not fidget, look around distractedly, or show any signs of impatience. He absorbed every word with the focused concern of someone much older and more experienced in dealing with human crisis. When Elena finished explaining her situation, Prince George was quiet for a long moment. Marcus could see him thinking carefully about what he had heard. Finally, the 10-year-old boy looked up at Mrs. Patterson and asked about the process for emergency staff assistance funds. Mrs. Patterson explained that while such funds existed, the application process typically took several days and Elena needed to travel immediately. The bureaucratic timeline would not meet the urgent need of the situation. Prince George nodded thoughtfully, then asked a question that surprised everyone present. He wanted to know if his own allowance money could be used to help Elena purchase her airline ticket immediately. The question was asked with such innocent directness that it took several moments for the adults to fully process what he was suggesting. Mrs. Patterson gently explained that there were protocols and procedures that would need to be followed, that such matters needed to be discussed with senior palace officials before any decisions could be made. But Prince George's concern was immediate and practical. Elena needed help now, not after days of administrative procedures. Marcus felt something shift inside him as he watched the young prince navigate this crisis with such natural empathy and decisive action. George was not interested in protocol or procedure when faced with genuine human need. His response was instinctive and generous, driven by compassion rather than rules. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Prince George asking detailed questions about Elena's mother's condition and the timeline for her travel. He wanted to understand every aspect of the situation so that he could determine the best way to help. Throughout the entire interaction, Marcus was struck by the profound respect that Prince George showed for Elena's dignity. He never spoke down to her, never treated her distress as an inconvenience, and never suggested that her personal crisis was less important than his own royal obligations. By the time they finally returned to the main palace building, Marcus knew that something fundamental had changed. He had witnessed a level of genuine leadership and compassion that challenged everything he thought he understood about duty, service, and what it meant to truly care for others. The image of 10-year-old Prince George, sitting beside a distraught staff member and offering his own money to help solve her crisis, would remain with Marcus for the rest of his life. It was a moment that revealed the extraordinary character of the young boy he was sworn to protect. The days following Elena's crisis brought unexpected changes throughout the palace. Word of Prince George's compassionate response had spread quietly among the staff, not through gossip or sensational storytelling, but through the kind of respectful sharing that occurs when people witness something truly remarkable. Marcus found himself observing these changes with growing amazement. Elena had been able to travel to Spain within hours of Prince George's intervention. The young prince had personally spoken with his father's private secretary, explaining the situation with such clear conviction that emergency funds were authorized immediately. Elena's mother survived her stroke, and Elena was able to be with her during the critical first days of recovery. But the impact of that morning extended far beyond Elena's personal crisis. Marcus began noticing subtle shifts in how the staff interacted with Prince George, and more importantly, how the young prince continued to engage with everyone around him. During his morning walks, Prince George now made more frequent stops to speak with various staff members. He would ask James the gardener about his arthritis, which had been troubling him during the recent cold spell. He remembered that Sarah from housekeeping was preparing for her daughter's wedding and would inquire about the planning progress. He checked on Mrs. Henderson's recovery from her recent surgery and asked about her grandchildren's school activities. What struck Marcus most powerfully was that none of these interactions felt forced or performative. Prince George's interest in the people around him was genuine and sustained. He remembered details from previous conversations and followed up with thoughtful questions that showed he had been thinking about their concerns even when they were not present. The young prince's quiet strength began manifesting in new ways that challenged Marcus's understanding of leadership and authority. During a formal palace tour for visiting dignitaries, Marcus watched as George noticed that one of the elderly servants was struggling with a heavy tray. Without drawing attention to himself or disrupting the formal proceedings, George simply stepped forward and offered to help carry some of the items. The gesture was so natural and unassuming that most of the visitors never even noticed it. But Marcus saw how the elderly servant's face lit up with gratitude, and he witnessed the pride and affection in the eyes of other staff members who observed the young prince's instinctive kindness. These moments of quiet compassion were becoming more frequent, and Marcus realized that Prince George was developing a leadership style that was completely different from anything he had seen before. The boy was learning to lead through service, to command respect through kindness, and to exercise authority through humility. One particularly memorable afternoon, Marcus accompanied Prince George on a visit to the palace's historical archives, where the young prince was researching a school project about the history of royal service. As they worked through old documents and photographs, George became fascinated by stories of previous royal family members who had used their positions to help others during times of crisis. Prince George spent hours reading about his great-grandmother's work with charitable organizations, his grandfather's military service, and various family members who had dedicated their lives to public service. Marcus could see the young boy processing these stories, trying to understand how he might use his own position to make a positive difference in the world. The archivist, an elderly gentleman named Mr. Pemberton, who had worked in the palace for over 40 years, was clearly moved by Prince George's genuine interest in the family's legacy of service. As they worked together, Mr. Pemberton began sharing stories that went beyond the official records, personal anecdotes about the character and compassion of previous royal family members. Marcus listened as Mr. Pemberton described how Prince George's great-great-grandfather had personally visited wounded soldiers during World War I, not for publicity or official ceremonies, but simply because he felt it was his duty to comfort those who had sacrificed for their country. He told stories of royal family members who had quietly funded scholarships, supported struggling families, and used their influence to address social problems. Prince George absorbed these stories with intense concentration, asking thoughtful questions about how these family members had balanced their official duties with their personal desire to help others. Marcus could see that the young boy was beginning to understand that true royal authority came not from privilege or position, but from genuine service to others. As they prepared to leave the archives, Prince George asked Mr. Pemberton if he had ever felt that his work in preserving these historical records was important to the ongoing mission of the royal family. The question caught the elderly archivist by surprise, and Marcus could see tears forming in the man's eyes as he realized that his decades of quiet service had been truly appreciated and understood. Mr. Pemberton explained that he had always hoped his work would help future generations understand the best traditions of royal service, but he had never expected to see such wisdom and compassion in someone so young. He told Prince George that the stories in the archives were not just history, but a guide for how to live with honor and purpose. The conversation with Mr. Pemberton marked another turning point for Marcus. He began to understand that Prince George's quiet strength was not just a pleasant personality trait, but a deliberate approach to leadership that drew inspiration from the best examples of his family's legacy. In the weeks that followed, Marcus witnessed Prince George applying these historical lessons to contemporary situations. When the palace chef mentioned that his son was struggling in school, Prince George asked his own tutors if they could provide some guidance. When one of the security guards injured his back and was worried about medical expenses, Prince George researched available support programs and personally ensured that proper assistance was provided. Each of these actions was carried out quietly, without fanfare or publicity. Prince George seemed to understand intuitively that genuine service was not about recognition or praise, but about making a real difference in people's lives. Marcus found himself profoundly moved by the young prince's evolving understanding of responsibility and service. At 10 years old, George was demonstrating a level of emotional intelligence and compassionate leadership that many adults never achieved. His quiet strength was not weakness or passivity, but a powerful force for positive change that was transforming everyone around him. The guard captain began to realize that protecting Prince George meant more than ensuring his physical safety. Marcus was witnessing the development of a future leader whose approach to authority could potentially change the way people thought about power, service, and the responsibilities that came with privilege. Marcus Thompson sat in his small apartment above the palace garage, staring at a letter he had been trying to write for over a week. The words would not come easily because they represented a conflict that was tearing at the very foundation of everything he had believed about his professional duty and personal integrity. For 15 years, Marcus had served as a royal guard with unwavering dedication and clear purpose. His role was defined by strict protocols, professional distance, and absolute loyalty to the crown. He had never questioned these parameters because they provided a framework that allowed him to serve effectively while maintaining the emotional detachment necessary for his position. But Prince George's quiet strength had shattered that carefully maintained emotional distance. Day after day, Marcus found himself not just protecting a member of the royal family, but witnessing the development of a truly extraordinary human being whose approach to life challenged everything he thought he understood about leadership, compassion, and service. The internal struggle had begun subtly, with small moments of admiration for the young prince's kindness and wisdom, but over the past several months these feelings had grown into something much more profound and troubling. Marcus was beginning to question not just his role as a guard, but his entire understanding of what it meant to serve something greater than himself. The conflict reached a critical point during a formal state dinner the previous week. Marcus had been assigned to provide security during the event, maintaining his usual position along the wall of the grand dining hall. From his post, he had a clear view of Prince George as the young boy participated in his first major diplomatic function. Throughout the evening, Marcus watched as 10-year-old George navigated complex social interactions with visiting dignitaries, foreign officials, and other members of the royal family. The prince's behavior was impeccable, showing respect for cultural traditions, engaging in appropriate conversation, and demonstrating the kind of diplomatic awareness that typically took years to develop. But what struck Marcus most powerfully was how Prince George maintained his authentic compassion even in this highly formal setting. When an elderly ambassador struggled to rise from his chair, George immediately but discreetly offered assistance. When a young translator seemed nervous about her first state dinner assignment, the prince took time to speak with her kindly, helping her feel more comfortable in the intimidating environment. Marcus realized that he was witnessing something unprecedented. Prince George was not simply performing his royal duties. He was transforming them. The young boy was demonstrating that it was possible to fulfill formal obligations while maintaining genuine human connection and compassion. As the evening progressed, Marcus found himself less focused on potential security threats and more absorbed in watching Prince George's remarkable ability to bring out the best in everyone around him. Foreign dignitaries who had arrived with serious formal demeanors were soon smiling and engaging in warm conversation with the young prince. Staff members who typically remained invisible during such events found themselves acknowledged and appreciated for their service. The realization that followed this observation was both beautiful and devastating for Marcus. He understood that Prince George was not just a future king. He was a young person who could potentially change the way leadership was practiced and understood. The boy's quiet strength had the power to inspire genuine transformation in individuals and institutions. But with this realization came a profound personal crisis. Marcus had dedicated his entire adult life to protecting the royal family, but he had always thought of this service in terms of duty and professional obligation. He had never expected to find himself emotionally invested in the character and future of the person he was protecting. The letter he was attempting to write was his formal resignation from the royal guard. For weeks he had been struggling with the growing conviction that his feelings about Prince George had compromised his ability to serve effectively. Professional guards were supposed to maintain emotional distance, to be ready to make objective decisions based on security protocols. Rather than personal attachment, Marcus feared that his admiration and affection for Prince George would interfere with his judgment in critical situations. Would he be able to make difficult security decisions if they might cause distress to the young prince? Could he maintain the necessary professional detachment when faced with threats to someone he had come to care about so deeply? The internal conflict was made worse by Marcus's growing understanding of how much Prince George valued their relationship. The young prince had never directly expressed personal feelings about Marcus's presence, but his appreciation was evident in small gestures and quiet acknowledgments. George seemed to understand that Marcus's protection went beyond professional duty, and he responded with the kind of trust and affection that made the guard's emotional distance even more difficult to maintain. Marcus had tried to discuss his concerns with his supervisor, Captain Reynolds, but their conversation had only deepened his confusion. Reynolds had acknowledged that Marcus's situation was unusual, but had pointed out that his effectiveness as a guard had actually improved. Over the months he had been working closely with Prince George. Reynolds observed that Marcus's genuine care for the young prince had made him more vigilant, more attuned to potential threats, and more committed to ensuring George's safety and well-being. Rather than compromising his professional performance, Marcus's emotional investment seemed to have enhanced his ability to serve effectively. This feedback had forced Marcus to reconsider his assumptions about professional duty and emotional engagement. Perhaps the rigid separation between personal feelings and professional service that he had maintained for 15 years was not actually necessary or beneficial. Maybe genuine care and emotional investment could coexist with professional competence and effective service. The question that haunted Marcus as he struggled with his resignation letter was whether he could find a way to serve Prince George that honored both his professional obligations and his personal conviction that he was protecting someone truly special. Could he maintain his effectiveness as a guard while acknowledging that his motivation had evolved from duty to something much more personal and meaningful? As he sat with his unfinished letter, Marcus realized that the answer to his dilemma might not lie in choosing between professional duty and personal investment, but in finding a way to integrate both into a new understanding of what it meant to serve someone whose quiet strength had the power to transform everyone around him. The young prince's example had taught him that true strength often came from vulnerability, that real leadership emerged from service to others, and that the most powerful authority was exercised through compassion and humility. Perhaps Marcus's own evolution as a guard could reflect these same principles. The morning that would change Marcus Thompson's life forever began with an unexpected disruption to Prince George's carefully established routine. Instead of emerging from his quarters at 7:30 for his usual walk through the palace gardens, the young prince appeared at Marcus's security station at 6:15. Still in his pajamas and clearly distressed, Marcus immediately stood at attention, his training taking over as he assessed the situation for potential threats. But as he looked at Prince George's face, he realized that the 10-year-old boy was not in physical danger. Instead, he was experiencing the kind of emotional crisis that no amount of security training could adequately prepare someone to handle. Prince George's eyes were red from crying, and his usual composed demeanor had given way to the raw vulnerability of a child who was struggling with something far beyond his years. In his small hands, he clutched a letter that Marcus would later learn contained news that would test the young prince's character in ways neither of them could have anticipated. With the same quiet dignity that characterized all his interactions, Prince George asked if he could speak with Marcus privately. The request was unusual given the early hour and informal circumstances, but Marcus could see that the young prince was facing something that required immediate attention and understanding. They walked together to a small sitting room adjacent to the security office, where Prince George carefully closed the door and took a seat in one of the oversized chairs. Marcus remained standing, uncertain about the appropriate protocol for this unprecedented situation. In a voice that trembled slightly, but remained clear and determined, Prince George began to explain what had happened. He had received a letter from a young girl named Lucy Hartwell, a 9-year-old from a small town outside London, who had been writing to various members of the royal family as part of a school project about British institutions and democracy. Lucy's initial letter had been cheerful and innocent, asking Prince George about his favorite subjects in school and whether he enjoyed living in a palace. Prince George had responded personally, something that was unusual but not unprecedented for members of the royal family when dealing with children's correspondence. What followed was a series of letters that revealed Lucy's increasingly difficult personal situation. Her father had lost his job 6 months earlier and had since struggled with depression and alcohol addiction. Her mother was working 2 jobs to try to maintain their household, leaving Lucy to care for her younger brother much of the time. The latest letter, which Prince George held in his trembling hands, contained news that Lucy's family was about to lose their home. The mortgage payments had fallen behind, and despite her mother's desperate efforts to find additional work, they would be evicted within the week. Lucy had written to Prince George not asking for money or intervention, but simply because he had become her one source of hope and connection during an increasingly desperate time. Marcus listened in amazement as Prince George read portions of Lucy's letter aloud. The young girl's words were filled with mature understanding of her family's situation, but also with the kind of innocent faith that only a child could maintain in the face of such overwhelming circumstances. She told Prince George that writing to him had helped her feel less alone, and that knowing someone cared about her story made the difficult days more bearable. But what moved Marcus most deeply was Prince George's response to Lucy's crisis. The 10-year-old prince was not just sad about the situation. He was grappling with profound questions about responsibility, privilege, and the moral obligations that came with his position. Prince George looked up at Marcus with tears in his eyes and asked a question that would haunt the guard captain for the rest of his life. He wanted to know whether it was right for him to live in a palace with hundreds of rooms while Lucy and her family were about to become homeless. He asked whether his comfortable life had any
meaning if he could not use his resources and position to help people like Lucy,
who were facing genuine hardship. The young prince's anguish was not the temporary upset of a child who had encountered something sad on television. This was the deep moral wrestling of someone who was beginning to understand the weight of privilege and the responsibility that came with the power to make a difference in other people's lives. Marcus found himself in an impossible position. His training had prepared him to handle security threats, medical emergencies, and various forms of physical danger. But nothing had prepared him to counsel a 10-year-old boy who was experiencing a moral crisis that challenged the very foundations of the royal system he was sworn to protect. Prince George continued to share his thoughts and feelings about Lucy's situation, revealing a level of emotional intelligence and ethical reasoning that was extraordinary for someone his age. He understood that there were protocols and procedures that governed how members of the royal family could respond to individual cases of need. He knew that there were charitable organizations and official channels designed to address social problems. But Prince George also understood that Lucy's crisis was immediate and personal, that bureaucratic processes and institutional responses might not be adequate to address the urgent need of one frightened little girl and her struggling family. The conversation continued for over an hour, with Prince George wrestling through the complex emotions and moral questions that Lucy's letter had raised. Marcus found himself participating in a discussion that was far beyond anything he had ever expected to encounter in his role as a royal guard. As the young prince talked through his feelings and concerns, Marcus began to understand that he was witnessing something unprecedented. Prince George was not just experiencing sympathy for someone in need. He was developing a personal philosophy of leadership and service that would guide his approach to his royal duties for the rest of his life. The 10-year-old boy was learning that true authority came with genuine responsibility for the well-being of others, that privilege was meaningful only when it was used to serve those who had less, and that leadership required the courage to act according to moral conviction, even when such action challenged established procedures and expectations. By the time their conversation ended, Marcus realized that Prince George's quiet strength had evolved into something even more powerful and transformative. The young boy was not just demonstrating compassion and kindness. He was developing the kind of moral courage and ethical leadership that could change the world. The moment when Prince George asked for Marcus's help in responding to Lucy's crisis would mark the beginning of the guard captain's final transformation. He was no longer just protecting a member of the royal family. He was witnessing the development of a future leader whose character and convictions would challenge him to reconsider everything he believed about duty, service, and the courage to do what was right. The afternoon following Prince George's emotional revelation about Lucy Hartwell's situation brought an unexpected visitor to the palace. Marcus was surprised to receive word that Captain Reynolds wanted to meet with him privately in the senior officers' conference room, a formal setting that suggested the conversation would be significant. As Marcus entered the oak-paneled room, he found Captain Reynolds seated at the long mahogany table, With several official documents spread before him, Reynolds gestured for Marcus to take a seat across from him, and the serious expression on his face immediately told Marcus that this meeting was about more than routine security matters. Reynolds began by acknowledging that he had been observing Marcus's work with Prince George over the past several months. He noted that Marcus's dedication and effectiveness had actually improved during this period, but he had also noticed that the traditional emotional distance expected of royal guards had evolved into something much more personal and invested. The conversation that followed was unlike any Marcus had experienced in his 15 years of service. Reynolds explained that he had received reports about Prince George's unusual morning routine, his increasing involvement with palace staff, and his growing interest in using his position to address individual cases of need. While none of these behaviors were problematic in themselves, they represented a significant departure from traditional royal protocols. Reynolds revealed that he had also learned about Lucy Hartwell's correspondence with Prince George and the young prince's distress over her family's impending eviction. He explained that such situations put members of the royal family in difficult positions, as they could not practically respond to every individual case of hardship that came to their attention. Marcus listened with growing concern, fearing that he was about to be reprimanded for allowing Prince George's compassionate instincts to develop without adequate supervision. But Reynolds surprised him by taking the conversation in an unexpected direction. The captain explained that he had been in communication with senior palace officials about Prince and George's evolving character and leadership style. Rather than viewing the young prince's compassion and moral conviction as problematic, these officials recognized that they were witnessing the development of something extraordinary. Reynolds shared that historical examples showed some of the most effective and beloved members of the royal family had been those who found ways to use their positions for genuine service and meaningful assistance to others. Prince George's natural inclination toward this kind of leadership was seen as a positive development that could enhance the relevance and impact of the royal family in contemporary society, but this recognition came with acknowledgement that traditional royal protocols and security procedures might need to evolve to accommodate Prince George's character and convictions. The young prince's desire to respond personally to cases of need, like Lucy Hartwell's situation, required a different approach to royal service and protection. Reynolds then asked Marcus a question that would change the trajectory of both their lives. He wanted to know whether Marcus would be willing to accept a new and unprecedented role as Prince George's personal liaison for charitable and service activities. This position would involve working directly with the young prince to develop appropriate responses to individual cases of need, coordinating with charitable organizations and social services, and ensuring that Prince George's desire to help others could be fulfilled in ways that were both effective and appropriate for his position. The role would require Marcus to move beyond traditional security duties and become a partner in Prince George's developing mission of service. It would involve significant additional training in social work, charitable administration, and youth development. Most importantly, it would require Marcus to acknowledge and embrace the personal investment he had developed in Prince George's character and future. Marcus sat in stunned silence as he processed this unexpected offer. The position Reynolds was describing would formalize and validate the transformation he had been experiencing over the past several months. Instead of being reprimanded for his emotional involvement with Prince George, he was being asked to make that involvement the foundation of a new kind of service. Reynolds continued by explaining that this new role had been developed specifically in response to Prince George's unique character and potential. The palace officials recognized that the young prince's approach to leadership and service was extraordinary, and they wanted to ensure that he had the support and guidance necessary to develop these qualities effectively. The position would also involve working with Lucy Hartwell's family and similar cases that Prince George encountered in the future. Marcus would be responsible for conducting appropriate investigations, coordinating with local authorities and charitable organizations, and ensuring that help was provided in ways that were both meaningful and sustainable. As Reynolds outlined the details of this new role, Marcus began to understand that he was being offered an opportunity to serve something much larger than traditional security duties. He would be part of Prince George's developing mission, to use royal privilege for genuine service to others, particularly those facing hardship and need. The conversation concluded with Reynolds giving Marcus time to consider this unprecedented opportunity. The captain acknowledged that the new position would be challenging and would require Marcus to develop skills and perspectives that went far beyond his military and security background, but Reynolds also expressed confidence that Marcus's genuine care for Prince George and his natural understanding of the young prince's character made him uniquely qualified for this role. The personal investment that Marcus had initially worried was compromising his professional effectiveness was now being recognized as the foundation for a new kind of service. As Marcus walked back to his apartment that evening, he carried with him the unfinished resignation letter he had been struggling to write for weeks. But now, instead of representing the end of his service to the royal family, the letter had become a symbol of transformation and new beginning. That night, Marcus carefully tore up the resignation letter and began writing a different document altogether. He was accepting Captain Reynolds's offer and committing himself to a role that would allow him to serve Prince George's extraordinary character and potential in ways he had never imagined possible. The decision to accept this new position was not just about career change or professional advancement. It was Marcus's recognition that Prince George's quiet strength had transformed not only his understanding of service and duty, but his entire conception of what it meant to dedicate one's life to something greater than oneself. The young prince's example had shown Marcus that true strength came from vulnerability, that real leadership emerged from service to others, and that the most meaningful authority was exercised through compassion and humility. Now Marcus would have the opportunity to support and protect these qualities as Prince George continued to develop into the kind of leader the world desperately needed. 6 months after Marcus Thompson accepted his new role as Prince George's personal liaison for charitable activities, he stood in the small living room of a modest house in Surrey, watching as 10-year-old Prince George played chess with 9-year-old Lucy Hartwell. The scene before him represented everything that had changed in both their lives since that emotional morning, when the young prince had shared Lucy's desperate letter. The transformation had begun immediately after Marcus accepted his new position. Working together, he and Prince George had developed a careful plan to help Lucy's family without creating dependency or drawing unwanted public attention to their situation. The mortgage payments had been quietly arranged through an anonymous charitable trust, giving Lucy's parents time to stabilize their financial situation without the shame of accepting what might seem like royal charity. But the assistance had extended far beyond immediate financial relief. Marcus had coordinated with local social services to ensure that Lucy's father received professional help for his depression and addiction struggles. Lucy's mother had been connected with job training programs that allowed her to develop skills for better paying employment. Most importantly, the family had been linked with ongoing support systems that would help them maintain their stability long after the initial crisis had passed. Prince George had insisted on maintaining personal contact with Lucy throughout this process. The two children had become genuine friends through their continued correspondence, and Lucy had been invited to visit the palace several times as part of educational programs that Prince George had helped develop for children from disadvantaged backgrounds. As Marcus watched the chess game unfold, he marveled at how naturally Prince George interacted with Lucy and the other children who had become part of their expanding charitable work. The young prince showed no trace of condescension or self-consciousness about the differences in their backgrounds. Instead, he engaged with each child as a friend and equal, learning from their experiences while sharing his own insights and perspectives. The past 6 months had brought a steady stream of similar cases. Children and families facing various forms of hardship had found their way to Prince George's attention through letters, school projects, and referrals from charitable organizations. Each situation had provided Marcus and the young prince with opportunities to develop their collaborative approach to meaningful assistance. Marcus had undergone extensive training in social work, charitable administration, and youth development during this period, but the most valuable education had come from working directly with Prince George and witnessing the young boy's natural wisdom in understanding human needs and developing appropriate responses. The prince's approach to helping others was characterized by the same quiet strength that had first impressed Marcus during Their morning walks through the palace gardens. Prince George never sought recognition or publicity for his charitable work. Instead, he focused on understanding each situation thoroughly and ensuring that assistance was provided in ways that preserved dignity and promoted long-term stability. One of the most remarkable developments had been Prince George's insistence on learning from the people he helped. He asked thoughtful questions about their experiences, their challenges, and their perspectives on social issues. These conversations had deepened the young prince's understanding of inequality, hardship, and the complex factors that contributed to human suffering. Marcus had watched as these experiences shaped Prince George's character and worldview. The 10-year-old boy was developing a sophisticated understanding of social responsibility and the obligations that came with privilege. But more importantly, he was learning that genuine leadership required humility, empathy, and the courage to challenge systems and expectations that prevented effective service to others. The chess game between Prince George and Lucy concluded with Lucy's victory, a result that delighted both children. As they reset the board for another game, Marcus reflected on how this simple interaction represented the transformation that had occurred in all their lives. Lucy's family had not only survived their crisis, but had emerged stronger and more stable than before. Lucy herself had blossomed under the friendship and encouragement of Prince George, developing confidence and ambitions that her previous circumstances had made difficult to imagine. Her grades had improved dramatically, and she had begun participating in extracurricular activities that were nurturing her natural talents and interests. For Prince George, the relationship with Lucy and the other children they had helped had provided something equally valuable. The young prince was learning that his position and privileges were meaningful only when they were used to serve others. These experiences were shaping him into the kind of leader who would understand the real needs and concerns of all people, not just those who moved in royal circles. Marcus himself had undergone the most dramatic transformation of all. His new role had revealed talents and passions he had never known he possessed. Working with Prince George on charitable activities had given him a sense of purpose and fulfillment that went far beyond anything he had experienced during his 15 years as a traditional royal guard. The relationship between Marcus and Prince George had evolved into something unique and unprecedented in royal service. They had become partners in a mission that transcended traditional protocols and hierarchies. Marcus was no longer just protecting the young prince's physical safety. He was supporting the development of a character and leadership style that could change the world. As the afternoon visit with Lucy's family drew to a close, Prince George asked Marcus if they could stop at the local community center on their way back to the palace. The young prince had learned that the center was struggling to maintain its after-school programs due to funding cuts, and he wanted to understand their situation more thoroughly. This request was typical of Prince George's evolving approach to his royal duties. Rather than simply attending formal events and ceremonial functions, he was actively seeking opportunities to understand and address real problems in his community. His quiet strength had grown into a powerful force for positive change that touched everyone he encountered. During the drive back to the palace, Prince George and Marcus discussed plans for their expanding charitable work. They had been invited to visit a school in Scotland, where students were developing innovative solutions to environmental problems. They were also coordinating with a youth organization in Wales that was working with homeless teenagers. Each of these activities represented opportunities for Prince George to continue learning about the world beyond the palace while using his position to support meaningful causes. But more importantly, they were shaping him into a leader whose authority would be based on genuine service to others. As they approached the palace gates, Marcus realized that the transformation he had experienced over the past year was irreversible. Prince George's quiet strength had changed not only his understanding of duty and service, but his entire conception of what it meant to live a meaningful life. The young prince had shown him that true strength came from vulnerability, that real leadership emerged from service to others, and that the most powerful authority was exercised through compassion and humility. These lessons had become the foundation of Marcus's new life and purpose. Looking ahead, Marcus knew that his role would continue to evolve as Prince George grew and developed. But he also knew that the fundamental mission would remain the same: supporting the development of a leader whose character and convictions could inspire positive transformation in individuals, institutions, and society as a whole. The journey that had begun with simple morning walks through the palace gardens had become something neither of them could have anticipated. Prince George's quiet strength had not only moved Marcus to lay down his traditional post, but had opened the door to a new kind of service that was more meaningful and transformative than anything either of them had ever imagined possible.